to me. Okay, Pastor Mark, join now. More. Share. That's what I'm looking for. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Nope. Select a tab to share. Window. This one. Ah! I always feel good when I get it on the first try. So. All right. I'm wearing the microphone because y'all all sit toward the back and don't want to feel like I got to yell. You can yell at me, but I'm not going to yell at you. No, that's not true. Well, partly true. But we're streaming this, so I have to wear this. So, how's everybody? Boy, that was exciting. Let's try that again. How is everybody? It's a new year. It's already the 10th of the month, which means that the month is over. We just spend the next 20 days trying to figure out the last 10 days or the first 10 days. So, yeah, new year, new you. How many times have you written the date wrong? Yeah. Yeah, I know. I don't want to be there yet, but we're here. So, Madison was just sharing with me that Miss Billy Oliver, she was supposed to go for a scan yesterday, but now it's put off to next week. She is. Did I tell you Sunday that it's a malignant tumor that's on her kidney? The kidney that they took a portion of year before last, or was it earlier last year? I know I took her to the doctor several times last year after. Same one. Yeah, yeah. She still has the good one, and she tried to get the doctors to take this kidney that has the tumor now. She tried to get them to take the whole thing when she had her surgery, but they were fearful of her not having enough function in the other. It's not fully functional. It still has problems, but not like the one that's had the cancer. So we want to remember Miss Billy and encourage her. If you got a minute to call her. She doesn't always answer the phone, but if she feels like answering, she'll talk to you. So,
really concerned. She told me this afternoon she's worried.
Yeah.
Very worried.
Well, cancer is worrisome.
Yeah, she needs some help.
Yeah.
I'll bring her some groceries tomorrow, and I guess we need to check in on her and see. I told her if I'm off, I'd take her to the doctor, but she's worried.
Well, I'm going to touch base with her. And Ashley will have a baby this time next week, huh? Or a little later. When? Well, next Wednesday. I wasn't too far off. All right. Well, we're praying for you too, girl. That all that'll go well. What else? Yes. Okay. Yeah. 12 years old. That's tough.
I'd also like to remember my coworker. He had a esophageal tumor, and it ended up breaking through his windpipe. So they took out the tumor, but now they're going to have to rebuild his.
That's Joey Poland. Same thing. So
Really?
might be somebody to draw some wisdom from on that. He's.
But I also have a friend of mine who Monday he had triple bypass
Isn't it nice to have Patsy around to remind you how much you're loved?
I'm always so sweet to her, that's what I
Uh,
Remember me, Brother Mark, as this year starts and I approach semi-retirement, and that it seems like the Lord's put it on my heart this year. My word is intentional with my life, and it is changing. It has been changing. My faith is different, and I have my own trials right now. But for the first time I can remember, probably since my late husband got sick and died, I'm not wringing my hands. I'm not losing sleep. I'm moving on. I'm trusting him no matter
Yeah.
what. And just pray for me that I'm intentional in every step of my life.
Intentional is a good word. Man, that's a really good word to include in the way that we live our life, because there's a lot of things out there that are just bang against us and push us around like a pinball. And to be intentional doesn't allow that, and that's good. That's good stuff. Okay. I was at the jail today. It's 10th week out there. There was an overdose. So, all the great efforts that are going on to keep that from happening, and they've done a great job, but somebody was able to slip some through, and it, anyway, that happened. And then, of course, about the child that was beaten to death in Albany, and that man is out there. And personalities like that cause just tension everywhere. And you can feel it, when you go. And so today was a interesting day in that particular dorm. It's a lot to pray about for these families that have suffered through horror like that. And I think they're from Indiana, somebody told me. And so the whole situation, it's you could almost disconnect from it, but can't imagine that. So the church is more important to the world than ever. Even agnostics and atheists will tell you that the world's a better place because of the church. And we've got a lot of work to do. So we have to be intentional about how we do it, about how we live our lives, about how we do the work, because it's only gonna get worse. So let's pray and we'll begin. We love you, Father, and we thank you so much for the privilege of being here together tonight as your people, as your children, as your servants, all the different ways that the Bible allows for us to be claimed by you. It opens up so many visions and so many opportunities to wherever we are in our station in life, we can always turn and know that you're our Father. In those moments where our pride may begin to get the best of us, we realize that we serve you. And Father, as Creator, we know that we are utterly dependent upon you because you've created us. The world believes that we cannot know you, but through your Son, Jesus, you made it clear that we could know you. So we thank you for that. And as we acknowledge you in all these things, we ask for your care and intervention in these that we've mentioned that are hurting to the depths of their core over loss of a child. We just ask, God, that your peace invade their lives in a way that might be quite unexplainable to them, but they have a sense of who you are. For Miss Billy, who is struggling through this, yet again another challenge in her health, that you will give her strength and courage and patience and provide for her the love of a church that indeed does love her. And let us always carry her in our thoughts and prayers and to respond to her with our hands and our feet. And for Lee's friends, and for Matthew, and for every other person that has raced through our minds as we've begun this prayer to you. We just ask, God, that your presence change everything in their lives. And God, it says we study your word and let it open our hearts more deeply and intently to who you are and to what you would have us be and to what you would have us do with our lives. And these things we pray in the name of Jesus. Amen. So we're going to be again in the Synoptics. Did y'all miss it while we were gone? Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, you've been in Mark, reading through. Yeah. So you remember that when we left, it was Peter's confession. We'll back up. Kind of where we stopped in the middle of the story because my alarm went off. And I didn't set it tonight, so I'll have to watch the clock. But the confession that we're speaking of is the confession where Jesus asked his disciples. We're going to look in Matthew, begin with Matthew 16:13. It says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, which is in the northern end of Galilee, Caesarea Philippi was the summer home to Herod the Great. The mountain there, there's another passage where Jesus is there with his disciples, and he says, if you had the faith of the mustard seed, you can tell this mountain to be thrown into the sea, and it would. Well, there's more to that than just a mountain. What had happened in Caesarea Philippi when they built Herod's summer home, it wasn't, he loved the location, but he couldn't see the ocean. So you know what he did, right? He built the mountain. Okay? He built the mountain and built his summer home on top of it so he could see the lush valley on one side and the ocean on the other. And so this is where Jesus is. Okay? And in their response, they speak to something that Herod had done, and that was kill John the Baptist. So Herod looms large throughout the Bible story. He really does. And we kind of overlook that sometimes because he's kind of crazy. I mean, he's a crazy man. But that's the point that the narratives are bringing out. Here you have Jesus that is the perfect human being. And every time you turn around, it's these crazy wackos that are in control that seemingly should have all the power, but ultimately they believe that they do, but ultimately they don't. And so even in these places where we don't even hear it spoken out loud, the contrast between Herod and Jesus is also pointing to the cross. Because the real power that is exercised is not over building a mountain where you could put a house on it and see wherever you want to see. Jesus says if you've got the faith of a mustard seed, you can throw that mountain into the sea. The real power rests with Christ, and that power is manifest and made known to us on the cross. So everything, even that, pushes us toward the cross and leads us to the cross. So it says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? Which is his favorite name for himself. And they said, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. So John the Baptist obviously was dead by this time. We've already just covered that. Elijah rode in the chariot to heaven, see, so he didn't die, so certainly he would have come back. And then Jeremiah was a prophet that, one of the earlier prophets that didn't speak of a Messiah as a military person, but as one that would come the way Jesus came. So there's some ideas about that. But Jesus, he wants a more pointed answer from these guys. So he says, but you, and he's speaking to them individually. Who do you say that I am? Now they're about 2 years into this ministry with Jesus. Okay? And it's all of a sudden become, this is the moment where there always comes a moment where there has to be some clarity. Jesus calls us to a point of clarity about who we are in relation to him. If we're pursuing him at all, we know he's always pursuing us. But when we pursue him, there always has to be a moment of clarity with whether or not this is going to actually be true for us or not. I mean, is that right? We talk about it, we can study it, we can give all the Sunday school answers we want. But somewhere in the dark places of night, or in a moment where we've really got, there's been an epiphany moment with God somewhere we come to that point of saying, yes, he is the Son of God. He is the Savior of the world. 2,000 years later, we still come to those points. And so he asked them, and Simon says, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God, which these two things together, being the Messiah and being the Son of the living God, was the totality of the idea of who Messiah was. Okay? Now they're thinking about that was when the Son of God came, then God's kingdom was set up on earth forever. There was no way anything could ever conquer the Son of God when he came back to earth. So this was not only a religious statement or a faith statement for Peter, it was also a very political statement. This is going to change everything now that you're here, Jesus. There's going to be a strength and a power that can conquer all of our enemies. Okay? Which he was right. It just doesn't in the way that Jesus does all of that, just not in the way that they had hoped that he would or dreamed that he would, but ultimately we're thankful that he did. So Jesus says to them, responded, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. You remember earlier, he said, I'm only going to give you a sign, and that's going to be the sign of Jonah. That's what he was telling the people in Capernaum before they left and started this little stroll by the sea. Okay? So Matthew reminds us that by name, Peter kind of relates back to that idea of what's the sign of Jonah. Okay? He's reminding us again. And what was the sign of Jonah? We talked about it before. I know it's been a long time. You've eaten a lot of fudge and cake and candy and a lot of food since then, but your brains still work. So there were two signs that we looked at. One was that Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days, and the Son of Man would be belly in the earth for 3 days. But what was the other sign that is mentioned just not as directly as the 3 days? That is, that the people in Nineveh repented. Okay? Those who were lost repented. And that's exactly what Jesus came to have men do. We were lost, and we were able to come to him. We were able to repent, turn away from our evil ways, and come to him. So he said, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overpower it. So we talked a little bit about that last time, the different kinds of rock that are mentioned in the New Testament. And this particular rock, the word Peter doesn't describe bedrock that we're talking about. It describes a stone that you can hold in your hand. So it kind of changes the vision, doesn't it? You always think about it being rock that you build upon because he's building his church. But it's a rock that Jesus can hold in his hand. Okay? That's the kind of rock that he's going to build. Okay? So does it have to do more with Peter? Or does it have to do more with the confession that Peter makes? And this has been a discussion through the ages. The Catholic Church in Rome determined that when Jesus said, upon this rock I will build my church, that it was talking of Peter, and that Peter would become the founder of the church. Okay, many other scholars recognize that it wasn't so much Peter that's the rock, but it is the confession that Peter makes that literally Jesus can take in his hand, okay, and use. Now, how does he use that confession? It goes on to say, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades, or hell, cannot prevail against it. So we see in this whole dialogue that he has with Peter that not only is there a declaration of the truth of Jesus, there's also a declaration of the truth of God's people. This is who you are. You are a people in the hand of God that goes against the power of Satan, and you defeat it. Hasn't changed in 2,000 years. That's what Jesus intends for his church. Okay? So the church, it's the last people in the world that get to say, it's bad and it's only going to get worse. Because Jesus said, it's bad, but I'm sending you out there to defeat it. So if we're just resigned to it getting worse, it means that we've given up our job, basically. That's one way to look at that. And then he says, I will give you the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. A lot of discussion about this in commentaries, but let me just simplify it this way for you. My church, Jesus is saying, is enmeshed and integrated with the will of God. Whatever you are doing on earth, it is because of the will of God in heaven. Okay? So whatever you bind, whatever you loose, this is all connected with the will of God. The church does not operate outside the will of God. Okay? So you can call yourself a church all day long, have the sign on the, on the building, but until you're resigned to this idea, our life is totally and utterly directed and dependent on the will of God. That's a healthy church. That's the first place that we lay the stone, right there. It's in the will of God. Now, how do we do that as a church? Each one of us have to be of one mind and one accord, like Paul describes richly in 3 of his letters. Is that we've got to join together in this, and we do it by what? The Spirit that Jesus promised would do all of those. Which is, I'm way ahead now, but that's how it happens. Okay. Then he gave the disciples orders to tell no one that he was the Messiah. All right, so they've just made the discovery of a century, a discovery of the last 1,000 years, and Jesus is telling them, and don't tell anybody. Okay, why is that? Why is Jesus intent on leaving this a secret? Don't fully understand it, do they? We find out that later. And we can't fully understand it until we see him on the cross. So anything might have come up about why Jesus is declared the Messiah, and you could come up with 100 things, and 99 of them would be wrong until you know what he did on the cross. Then it's singular, and he either becomes a stumbling stone to your life, or he becomes Lord of your life. So it becomes much simpler to deal with, and Jesus knows this because he knows us. Too many options and too many questions results in no answers, or 1,000 answers that never mean anything. So then he goes on. Jesus foretells his death. From then on, Jesus began to point out to his disciples that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem and to suffer many things from the elders and high priests and scribes, be killed, and be raised on the third day. Mark's language is a little bit different. He talks about suffering many things and would be rejected, and so does Luke. So suffering and rejecting, they're 2 different words. They result in the same thing. But I think in Jesus' ears, being rejected would be worse than suffering. And that's where this whole thing comes to even today. You either reject him or you don't. So he tells them this, okay? And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Oh, no, Lord. this will never happen to you. Okay? So he makes this declarative statement where Peter puts himself in the place of Messiah, right? Now Peter's going to save Jesus. Instead of Jesus saving Peter, Peter's going to save Jesus. And he takes him aside and says, no. The significance of being taken aside in Matthew's gospel is so we can gather where Peter's attitude is. I'm bringing you aside over here, Lord, away from everybody, and I'm going to protect you. There's no way that's ever going to happen. Okay? Mark says it the same way. He spoke to him. Peter took him aside, and he began to... Mark calls it rebuking Jesus, which is a much stronger way. But Matthew, he records the rebuke. Now, Peter's just been given a revelation from God. So is this revelation from God? No, this revelation's from Peter. Okay? And so, Jesus turned and told Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me because you are not thinking about God's concerns, but human concerns. So we've already laid it out. The gates of hell are not going to prevail against the church because the church is the object of God's will and follows God's will. That's how we know we're the church. And the first thing that Peter does after realizing that is do something that declares, but I'm not the church because I'm not going to follow God's will. I'm going to declare Peter's will. Okay? And I'm going to pull you aside to make sure you understand that we're going to do it my way and not your way. But Jesus reminds him, no, you're not thinking about. You're not paying attention to God's concerns, which is what? God's will. Okay? You're only concerned with human motivations in this. Okay? Peter wanted Jesus to be a military, political, civic, I should say, Messiah that would just take control and make life right everywhere. And that never was the idea. And Jesus, he's got a lot to straighten out in people's lives, right? He's got a lot to straighten out in their old noodle up here. What is going on there? And he does. So, Peter, he's riding his high horse after he says that God's revealed something to me, and then he gets knocked off that horse rather quickly. But Jesus doesn't. Notice that the admonition is necessary for Peter. And we see that from this time really forward to the crucifixion. Not just for Peter, but for the disciples. There's a recurring theme now where they have to be brought low, humbled, for them to really begin to understand this. And it hasn't been a real issue until now. This is kind of a turning point in the story that's presented to us. So he says, then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone wants to follow me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Mark says it the same way. Luke says, if anyone wants to follow me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. So Luke adds one very important word, and that is daily. Okay. So how do we overcome our human inclinations toward Jesus? Jesus said there's only one way to do it, and that is what? Let him deny himself. What does he mean by here, deny himself? God's will first. Peter had put his will first, and Jesus said this is exactly the thing you cannot afford to do because you're not denying yourself. You're denying God. So you deny yourself, which is all that's left is God. Okay, you deny yourself, take up his cross. What does that mean? Some suffering involved in this. Yeah. Yeah, we're not ever allowed to imagine that this is all going to be rainbows and lollipops moving forward. Jesus makes it clear from the very beginning, I will suffer and you're going to suffer like I suffer. Okay, so suffering is integrated into following. There's no escaping it, Jesus is saying. So, man, I really want to go off on a tangent here, but I'm not. But the suffering that we experience, let's say as a matter of doing good. I'm going to use you, Kent, as an example, if you don't mind. Kent's got a friend who has been suffering with a brain cancer that is now, he's been treated, but it's coming back. There's tumors and that sort of thing. Okay? And this is painful to Kent because for years they've been friends and he's cared for him through his illness, all these various things. Now, if Kent didn't love his friend with the love of Jesus, then there wouldn't be any suffering. Kent would have never suffered. He wouldn't be suffering through this thing with his friend, see. But because of this, he is suffering. So you can remove yourself from your life of faith and just live life for yourself and never worry about anybody else. And chances are you're going to have a lot less suffering in your life than when you live by the love of Christ. You include yourself into the lives of others where there is always suffering, and you suffer with them. You see what I'm saying? So when he says that you take up your cross, it's exactly what he meant. That includes that suffering. But more specifically in this, Jesus is saying there's some suffering that comes as a matter of your faith in me. And for the most part in 21st century America, we've never suffered for our faith. But if you take a 7-hour plane ride to Africa, they are dying for their faith, see. But we're insulated and we're cut off from all of that because it's not in the news, and we depend on the news to know what's happening in the world, unfortunately.
Even then, we don't really get it.
No, we don't get it, but they understand. When you hear missionaries say that they've brought a child to Jesus and sending them home to their parents may be their death sentence for doing so, you know that that's a different world where taking up your cross takes on a whole new meaning than it does for us. But for Jesus, it was as real as anything that he would suffer. That's what his disciples would suffer. So I'm dwelling on this because the more that we try to live our lives insulated from our own suffering or the suffering of others, the more we are insulated from our following Jesus. We're just not doing it right. And we want to do it right because it's important to him, but it's important to the world that he came to save. So take up your cross and then follow me. So if you want to follow me, do these things, then follow me. Here's the desire, here's the reality. In between is to deny and take up your cross daily. Why daily? Why did Luke say daily? It doesn't take long for pride to creep back in so that we're living for ourselves. Luke's word is said this is a daily. Let me remind you that if you don't do this daily, you're not going to do it well at all. So.
Isn't it also, when we talk about like taking up your cross, isn't that the fact that as humans, when we take up our cross, just like where they turned on Jesus on the cross, we will have people around us, friends and family, that will turn on us due to our faith.
It's the same kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Really loved us and cared for us and had our best interests, will write us off and say, I want nothing to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and we've all been there to some level or degree or another where living a life of faith has cut us off from folks, and we tried to walk the middle of the road, ride the fence, whatever you want to call it. It never is satisfying. It's always, your life is always riddled with some level of guilt, or, you just don't understand. You don't understand anything about life at that point because you can't get your feet on solid footing. And just about everybody I know has a testimony that includes some of that. it's better just to go ahead and make up your mind that, hey, I'm just going to suffer with Jesus. And our suffering never will reach the zenith that his did, because it's for different reasons. The reasons matter, but we do relate to him at a different place when we allow suffering to be a part of our faith experience. That's why, you take a mission trip to somewhere. You get away from your home environment where it's comfortable, and you go somewhere like, we're talking about going to Memphis, and you deal with a different environment with people that live in the street and kids that, just kind of run wild, and it kind of helps you see that, and boy, in order to address this lostness, I'm going to have to pay a price in order to do what Jesus would have me do here. It's going to cost me something. We need to be reminded of that from time to time so that we can do a better job daily where we live. And all right. So then he goes on, 26. These are great parallel passages here. For what will it benefit someone if he gains the whole world yet loses his life? Or what will anyone gain, or what will anyone give in exchange for his life? Good questions. Okay? If you gain the whole world and yet lose your life. Now the word here is not your physical life. It's the substance of who you are. Okay? Yeah. Well, yeah, your soul. Yeah, the heart of who you are. So it would be, anybody ever see Citizen Kane? Yeah. Where he's asking for Rosebud. And here he is. He's lived his whole life this decadent. He just destroys people because he can do it for breakfast, He's this terrible guy, but in the end, all he wants back is Rosebud, which is his childhood sled that he rides down a hill, and we get to experience that. All he wants is the simplicity and innocence of his life back. And that's some of what's being, Jesus is saying here. What would you gain everything in life, but at the end, you've got nothing really. You've lost yourself. Or what would anyone give in exchange for his life? What would you give in exchange for your life? Give everything. But can you? So he says, for the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will reward each according to what he has done. Okay, so we've got some different parallels here in Mark and Luke that Dr. Robinson brings together here. He says, for whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of the Father with his angels. So let's see. Where are the parallels here? For the Son of Man is going to come. So what is Jesus speaking of? Not what he's doing now. It's when he returns. So he's already hinting at the fact that he's leaving, but he's returning. Okay? When I come, I will reward each according to what he has done. And he ties that to what? Are we ashamed of him or not? Okay. So Luke and Mark, Luke and Matthew share. Mark adds the idea of the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of the Father with his holy angels. So if we are ashamed of Jesus, he's going to be ashamed of us. Okay? This is on the day of judgment. So we've already learned in John, much earlier, that Jesus says, I didn't come to condemn anybody. It's what you believe about me is what will condemn you. And these are the same kind of words, just different linguistics and different context. Jesus is saying, if you're ashamed of me, I'll be ashamed of you. Now, that may sound petty a little bit, or like a quid pro quo type thing. Well, if you do this, I'm going to do that. And we think of that as rather being childish, to some degree. But what is Jesus saying?
That we will condemn ourselves.
Yeah. Being ashamed of the one who has come to do what? Resurrect you. To give you life. Okay? If you choose to be ashamed of that, then how is it that you are also not ashamed of the life that I'm giving you? See, it's tied together. We wouldn't want to receive anything from someone that we are ashamed of. Does that make sense? That's what he's really saying here. If you're ashamed of me, then what I have to give, which is life itself, you will also be ashamed of. Okay? And that's the testimony that I'm going to offer to my Father. Okay? Yeah, same kind of thing. Yep. All right. Then he goes on. Well, in Matthew, they read almost the same. It says, truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. It says the same thing. Well, standing here will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And the same and the same. Okay. So usually, this is it's a complicated passage because in context, Jesus has already spoken of his return. So do we read this as saying that there's going to be people here who will not die until I return again? Okay, that's one way of viewing that. The other way is to look at it, well, what he was meaning is that that there will be some who will not die until they experience his resurrection or coming in his kingdom, which many scholars believe that that's what that means, that coming in his kingdom means that now the final day has begun. The age of Christ has come, and many here, well, none of them had died. Well, we don't know who was there with him when he's talking, but none of the 12 had died anyway. So that's one way of looking at it. So some scholars have tried to take this as a kind of a spiritual death and resurrection. It's kind of stretching because the words don't work. So I kind of settle on the idea that he's speaking here now of the last days, which include his second coming, begin on Resurrection Sunday, that first Resurrection Sunday. Any comments about that?
My Bible says that in the commentary part says because all the disciples died before Christ returned, many believe that Jesus' words were fulfilled at the transfiguration. See the same thing wrong.
Yes, that's right. That's one of the options too, because that's coming up right on the tail end of this. So yeah, I forgot about the transfiguration. Yeah. Well, it makes it look like what we believe is not true. Yeah. And there's obviously so much more that we believe that we know does make it all true, even our own experience. I'm just of the camp that if we're speaking of the final day of his return, that whatever's included in that day is what he was speaking of, and I gather it being.
Well, and he goes on to say, others say this statement refers to Pentecost at the beginning of Christ's church, when Peter faced certain disciples were eyewitnesses.
And that would be,
And the glory of God's kingdom.
yeah, and that would be in the same final day. That the Hebrew mind thought of days basically in 3 days. There was the previous time, there's the day that they were in, and then there would be the final day. And we kind of follow that because our faith says that we've already received our salvation, but it's not complete because we're not with Jesus, and that's the promise. So we're already, but not yet, in the fullness of our salvation. Sir? Well, the transfiguration is just in the next chapter following this story, and it is that moment that that the lawgiver and the prophet come to be with Jesus. And many see that as the establishment of his kingdom, so that when Jesus does go to the cross, it's clear to who? To Jesus more than anybody. But also to Peter, James, and John that are there. But the flimsiness of that for me is that when the Spirit comes upon Jesus at his baptism, that's what I view as being that moment, where this is the point where Jesus, his ministry now begins, and everything that God will have him do, even on the cross, is a result of the Spirit guiding him to do that. So it's a complicated passage, and it's they're all three are constructed the same way, and of course Mark is considered the outline for Matthew and Luke. So Mark being the most everybody agrees that Mark is the oldest gospel that we have, and that Matthew and Luke used much of their source material from Mark, and then added what they needed to add to it to complete what Jesus or what God was instructing them to provide. But I don't want to get tied up on it too much. When we come across passages like that, how eager are you to dig more? Because, man, you can. There's a lot of good material. One thing about the internet that I do like is that if you want to look, and it used to be more, you could put in a search for a particular passage and you could get a lot of good stuff. That's changed since I guess algorithms and artificial intelligence it almost steers you away from the good stuff. So if you don't know, on Google there's a subheading where you can search, and it says scholars, and you can use the scholars tab to search, and you get much better commentary material. But it hides from you if you don't do that. It's really disappointing. Okay, so yeah, we're talking about the Transfiguration, and here we are. After 6 days, excuse me, Jesus took Peter. Let me find a map here. So see that number 1 right there? That is possibly one place for the Transfiguration. This is Caesarea Philippi, where we were just talking about, where Jesus was strolling along with his disciples. And then here is another possible location of Mount Hermon, which is a possible location of the Transfiguration. This one makes the most sense, although 6 days means that they were kind of meandering along, because that's not a 6-day walk by any means. Maybe a day, day and a half. So they're not in any big hurry, is my point. So you can kind of see where Jesus, he spent most of his time from here, especially in Galilee. He would spend most of his time in this area, okay? If you can see my little cursor going around. And then the only times that he spends any time in Judea down here in Jerusalem is when he goes to Jerusalem for some reason. A festival or something like that. So just to give you some geographical anchor to look at. So after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and his brother John and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. He was transfigured in front of them, and his face shone like the sun. His clothes became as white as light. Mark describes it, his clothes became dazzling, extremely white, as no launderer on earth could have whitened them. Luke says that he took him up on the mountain to pray, and as he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. So we put all three of these accounts together, and he takes these 3 guys that are closest to him, obviously, and he takes them up the mountain to pray, and as he is praying, everything about his presence changes, okay? Right down to his clothes. And so, that is what is the... What's that? No, I think it's literal. I think it was God's way of preparing Jesus for the presence of heavenly figures on earth. I think it's a taste of heaven is what it is. Okay, because here we have, suddenly Moses and Elijah appeared to them and was talking with him. So, yeah, what's the point in this whole exercise? Here come Moses and Elijah. Elijah, his body never died. Moses, we know his body died. He was, okay. And they appear with Jesus, and Jesus is changed for the moment. Heaven meets earth, and Jesus is changed for the moment to greet or to interact or to experience with these 2 visitors, okay? The radiance of heaven. At least that's how I see it. And they come and they're there to talk to him. Okay? So there's a discussion that needs to take place with Jesus and Moses and Elijah that we're not privy to at all. We don't get any clue as to what they talk about. We just know that they came to talk, which to me is just the coolest thing. This story just kind of comes up out of nowhere. It's like, why does this have to happen? And it's kind of like Jesus is about to set his face toward Jerusalem for the final time. And so it's like the Father sends Moses and Elijah, the great lawgiver and the great prophet, down to encourage, exhort, whatever he's doing, whatever they're saying to Jesus, Jesus needed. Maybe not as the Son of God, but as the Son of Man. He needed what these 2 guys were bringing him. And then it says, they appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which was about to be accomplished in Jerusalem. So we do have a little glimpse into one part that they were talking about. What are they speaking of? Luke says it's their departure. Are they speaking of his death? Are they just speaking of his resurrection? Are they speaking of his ascension back to the Father? We don't, maybe the whole thing collectively together. Okay. But that's what they're talking about, and that it's going to take place in Jerusalem. So do you see why it's important that Peter be here? See how loving Jesus is? Peter's got it all messed up just a chapter before. That, oh no, Jesus, you can't go there. I'm never going to let that happen to you. And now, who does Peter get to hear talking about it? Moses and Elijah. I mean, it would be like if you had heroes of the faith. If you were a little kid, a little Jew boy growing up, you would think, man, my heroes? Who are my heroes? Moses, he brought my ancestors out of slavery. And Elijah, that dude never died. He rode a chariot up to heaven. I mean, that would have been the 2 for me. It probably was the heroes for a lot of those guys. And here they are, and they're bringing reassurance to Jesus, but at the same time, reassurance to Peter. It says, everything you thought you knew, you don't know. And here we are, the lawgiver and the prophet, and we're helping you get it straight. It's because Jesus loves him and allows for him to experience that. Peter and those with him were in a deep sleep, and when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men who were standing with him. As the 2 men were departing from him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us set up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And then Luke reminds us, not knowing what he's saying, which was a common problem for Peter. Okay, so all of this is going on. They're half asleep, kind of in a daze. And when they finally come to their senses, Peter's first thing is, I don't want this to end. I want to let's just build some tabernacles here that you can sit under. We'll just stay here. I mean, quite the mountaintop experience. We talk about experiences on the mountain and experiences in the valley. This had to be one of the greatest mountaintop experiences that there was. But then we're reminded. Yeah. Yep. But then we're reminded that Peter doesn't know what he's saying. Which is, it's like, good idea, but for the wrong reasons. Okay? And so what happens next? As the two men were departing from him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us build three shelters. And then he says, while he was saying this, a cloud appeared and overshadowed them. Now, all of a sudden, what is this scene that they're at? This is like Sinai, when God would come down in the cloud. Okay? Or when God filled the temple, when Elijah went in to do his service, or when the musicians were playing in the temple and the cloud of smoke filled it to where all they could do was fall to the floor and worship. They couldn't even play their instruments anymore. Here we are, while he is saying this about let's just stay here, this cloud appears and overshadows them, meaning that it has overcome them. This is the presence of God that is with them. They became afraid as they entered the cloud. So the cloud's kind of coming down, and the closer it gets and the more it is around them, the fear just comes over them. Okay? Not unlike Isaiah in the temple, where he hit the floor and he says, oh, woe is me, I am undone. This is the end of me, is what he meant. And these guys were afraid. They became afraid as they entered the cloud. Then a voice came from the cloud saying, this is my son, the chosen one. Listen to him. And every one of the parallel gospels describe that. Matthew says, this is my beloved son, with whom I am well pleased, which is what is said to Jesus at his baptism. So he's saying it again, not to Jesus. He's saying it to his disciples. This is my son in whom I'm well pleased. And then he says, listen to him. So the idea is here, Peter is still listening to his own soul. We talked about this Sunday when the writer of Hebrews talks about separating soul and spirit. The soul being our own heart, our own conscience, and the spirit being that portion of us that is able to communicate and understand what God is after. And what is happening here is God has come to them directly and said, stop thinking about yourself. Stop listening to yourself. Listen to my son. Okay? And he says it in such a way that reminds us that we need to, sometimes we just need to shut up and listen. And this is what this moment help Peter understand, hopefully more clearly. So they have to leave there. That probably was a hard thing to do. You're probably thinking, is this like Mount Sinai? Is this another mountain that God comes upon? Is this another location? Well, we know about Sinai, but this one's new to us. Is this how God? Do we need to be here to have a moment like this again? And obviously, as Jesus goes on with them, as he continues to teach them, and as he brings them up to that final moment where he's about to be arrested, he is constantly teaching them that no, you don't need a moment on the mountaintop in a cloud. You have me. And I'm never going to leave you. I'm always going to be here with you. And I'm going to have my spirit here with you. So this was an experience that was almost necessary to connect and reinforce what Jesus is about to begin to teach them as they move toward Jerusalem, but most intently on the night that he's betrayed. so that there's this fullness that happens. Of course, they all run from the crucifixion, and all this stuff happens. That's why the idea of Pentecost is probably as important as anything that about, Jesus saying that this is, that when I return, there'll be those here that will not taste death. Okay, it says when the disciples heard this, they fell face down and were terrified, much like Isaiah was in the temple. And Jesus came up, touched them, and said, "Get up, don't be afraid."
Wow, how awesome is that? What does the Bible tell you all throughout? Do not fear.
Yeah. So Jesus comes up to them. They're petrified. He comes up to them, and what does he do? He touches them. I'm reminded again when I read this about how significant a human touch is for us. When we find ourselves in the moment of our greatest terror, in the moment of our greatest fear, our greatest uncertainty about everything. I mean, this is a lot's going on here. There's got to be some confusion. There's got to be, they want to stay, but here's God telling them just listen to Jesus. Jesus is about to tell them they've got to go. All of this is going on in their life, and the thing that Jesus says, the thing that he does first before he says anything is he touches them. And then he tells them, "Get up. Don't be afraid. We're going to move on." It's almost like it is almost like Elijah when Elijah's running from Jezebel and he's out in the desert, and he's given up. He's not afraid, but he's kind of given up. And God sends an angel to him and provides him with some food and some words. It says, "Get up. There's other things we got to do here. I've got other plans for you. There's 4,000 that are just like you. Don't think you're the only one." Blah blah. The whole story, But the idea is there's this reassurance from God that I'm going to take care of you, and I'm showing you that through this touch that I'm giving you. So, get up. Don't be afraid. When they looked up, they saw Jesus. They saw no one except Jesus alone. And they looked around and they saw there was no longer anyone with him but Jesus. After the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. Now, this is where Luke is different. Jesus finds them terrified and he comforts them. But in Luke's, they kind of come out of their fear and they find that Jesus is alone. And they kept silent at that time and told no one what they had seen. So it's kind of a different role. Instead of Jesus coming to them with comfort, they see Jesus alone and they leave him alone. Okay. This is a good example of the way that we choose scriptures to use when we study and read. Everybody reads Matthew's account, and they'll read Luke's up to a portion, but we never get to when we get to this, a verse like this, 17:8 or 9:8 or 9:36, we find the one that speaks to us the best, and we don't really go to the other gospel. So it's nice to know that Jesus touches us, but we don't really give a lot of attention to why they left him alone. Okay? And if Jesus was praying, they'd probably learn to leave him alone, because this wasn't the first time they'd been with him while he prayed. Later, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he goes to the garden to pray with them, and he leaves them to pray while he goes off alone. So could be some of that same dynamic here. But the thing is that they weren't going to tell anybody what had happened. Oh, let's see what time we got. Got to quit. Yeah. So the next is a healing passage that we'll look at next time. Any questions about any of that? Yeah.
And he kind of did that, and he still said, I will.
Well, you know, yeah, when we get to the denials of Peter, we're going to spend a little time because we've all been there. At various moments in our life, we have found it convenient for ourselves to kind of move Jesus away, which is what Peter's denial was. More graphic than that because of the scene. But in reality, what he's doing is what we've done before in our past, or maybe now we're struggling. But we kind of push Jesus away and say, you know, I don't need you a part of this. In fact, you're a liability at this point for what I want, or for my safety, or for my care. That just happens, and we don't mean for it to happen. It's just we find ourselves in the moment under pressure, and we make a bad choice. What's significant about that particular moment in Peter's life is that we have a warning by Jesus. Peter, this is what is going to happen to you. This is what you're going to do. And so we're all thinking, well, man, if Jesus has told me that I'm going to do that, I'm not going to do that. Which the whole point of that whole dialogue with Jesus and then what he does is to help us understand a very important thing. He always knows more about us than we know about ourselves. He always knows more. He always knows the thing that is going to get into our thoughts that's going to cause us to push him away. And the whole story is to remind us of that. Jesus always knows. And so in the moment when we once again realize that, that is the moment that we hit our knees and we say, Lord, forgive me. What Peter did after he realized, after the cock had crowed, that he wept bitterly. Why? Because everything that Jesus knew about him had the ugly Peter, see? And it broke his heart that ugly Peter was what had come out and had been in that moment. It was the ugly part of Peter that in that moment in the garden was his strength. It wasn't Jesus. It was the ugly side of him. And so he goes off bitterly and weeps. And then we see the whole confusion that Peter goes through on the resurrection morning. There's a lot of that that's recorded until finally we get to John's gospel at the end where Jesus reinstates him. And even then, Peter's not able to rise fully to who Jesus wants him to be. But at least at that point, he's honest. More honest than he was on the night that Jesus was betrayed. And he was talking so big about all the things he was going to do and not let happen again and all of that. So he reaches this level of honesty, and that is really what Jesus was looking for the whole time. You know, Jesus could have told Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times before the cock crows twice. And the honest thing Peter would have probably been able to say is, you know what, you're right. If he'd have been honest right then, the whole scene in the courtyard may have never happened. But he couldn't be honest with himself. But later he was definitely honest with Jesus. And he found out that Jesus could still love him and still use him. And it's a real lesson for us. Honesty with him. Yeah. Anything else? All right. Well, it does. But we'll be looking at the demoniac boy. We'll start there next week and that whole healing thing. And there's a lot for us to learn there too. So thank y'all so much.